Lieutenant George Burnett, a white officer, was in charge of this detachment, and they took a pursuit. Nana's trail was easy to find. He wasn't afraid to try to cover his tracks. He wanted to fight anybody and everybody. He was consumed with hatred. They chased Nana and about 40 renegades up into the Highlands area in the Cuchillo Negro Mountains, the Black Knife Mountains of the Southwest. Behind crevices and boulders, the Apaches and other renegades fired and pinned down the 15-man detachment, and also a complement of Mexican settlers who were allowed to join them in the pursuit. It looked like things were going to be very tragic because 4 of the troopers somehow got separated and were surrounded by some of the renegades. And they thought the detachment was beginning to fall back, so they said, "For God's sake, don't leave us." And so, Augustus Wally mounted his charger and thundered through the mass of warriors and got a wounded trooper up onto the saddle, and he threw himself up bareback just behind, and they double-horsed back to the rear area to safety. In time, the other troopers were saved, and some cavalry reinforcements arrived. But Augustus Wally was awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery and courage in this skirmish that took place in August of 1881. Wally really liked the Army, and he remained in until he finally retired in 1907, but not before he was in another war, the Spanish-American War in Cuba, the Battle of Las Guasimas. And again, he made another rescue. White Major James Bell was either injured or wounded, and Wally went out into the center of the firefight between the Spaniards and U.S. troops and got him back alive. For this, he was awarded a citation of bravery. Perhaps not as high in the hierarchy as the Medal of Honor, but certainly in terms of human life, every bit as important. After the Spanish-American War, Wally was working as a laborer at Camp Beauregard, Louisiana. When World War I started and the United States entered in 1970, Augustus Wally volunteered to join up again, but his age went against him. They appreciated his offer to sign up in the ranks and go overseas to the Great War, but no, he was just a bit too old, so he said, well, there's got to be something I can do, so he decided to stay on as an Army laborer as long as he could dig trenches, help put up buildings, and whatever else needed to be done to the infrastructure at Camp Beauregard. But finally, age came upon him, and he took ill and died at Reisterstown in Maryland, his hometown, and was buried with full military honors. And the church in the town renamed the street that passed by it Wally Way. For Wally, Augustus Wally, reliable, brave, courageous, as Lieutenant George Burnett described him, was one of God's own. Now we move on to the dawn of the 20th century in American military history. Agnes Meyer Driscoll, born 1889 in Gillespie, Illinois, the daughter of Professor Gustav Meyer and his wife, Lucy Meyer. This was someone who was well educated. She attended Otter Basin University in Ohio, and then after that, Ohio State University. She had a background in music and higher mathematics. Her first teaching assignment, because she thought teaching would be her lifetime career, was at Amarillo High School in Texas, where she was the head of the music department and gave one or more piano concertos. But then she thought, no, maybe I should also try to teach math. So she moved over to the math department and became the head of that department. She was a miracle worker with a pencil, an eraser, and graph paper, and could solve mathematical problems very, very easily. This was someone who was not satisfied with teaching, though. In 1918, the Great War, America had entered. She joined the United States Navy in Washington, D.C. And initially, she was a stenographer. Women in the Navy were something that were sort of unique back then, and she definitely was a patriotic and strong-willed individual who was going to work herself up the ranks. First of all, though, she let them know at the naval offices in Washington City that she had a mathematics background. So they thought, well, maybe between breaks in her typing assignments, we'll give her a few secret code ciphers to decipher. Look, she just deciphered that one in a few minutes. Give her another one. She deciphered that one too. Another. She deciphered all the codes. Nobody, their jaws dropped. How could anyone be this smart to decipher codes which the greatest cryptologists have had problems deciphering even in a training mode? But this was the true Agnes Driscoll Meyer, and this was her place in history, just starting out. So she resigned or was honorably discharged as a female yeoman in the Navy in around 1919, and she became a cryptographer in U.S. Navy codes and signals. She again resumed her remarkable career of deciphering these almost undecipherable codes. So finally, they tried to throw her a curveball. Through the courtesy of the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Japanese secret Navy code in 1924 had been, to put it politely, vouchsafed from the Japanese consulate. And we won't go into those details. She got the codes. 97,000 words, phrases, punctuation marks, numbers. What did it all mean? And the words were Japanese, so she learned enough Japanese to understand what she was undertaking. She cracked the code. It was absolutely incredible. There were a few parts she couldn't quite do, so there was some collaboration, but she was putting the United States Naval Intelligence ahead of the curve, and ever since the 1920s, the U.S. Navy has remained ahead of it. This was the father of modern U.S. naval intelligence. In 1940, she fully identified the Japanese code to the point where Japanese radio ship broadcasts, ship to ship, ship to shore, shore to ship, were now easily read. The code, always for each and every ship, warship, submarine, aircraft carrier, refueling tanker, troop ship, had a 5-numeral identification which the workers who were frantically learning how to follow in her wake called the 5-num code. It was astounding. And yes, the code had several uses. By listening in, one of the first ironic uses was that 2 Navy turncoats were giving secret information to the Japanese embassy. They were promptly apprehended and incarcerated. The next thing that happened was that while the U.S. was planning in the future for what they called fast battleships, it turned out through the code that they could listen in on Japanese cruisers in the Pacific. The Nagato class was their latest, 26 knot top speed. At that time, very fast. And so, finding that out, the U.S. Navy made its fast battleships even faster. So again, Agnes Driscoll Meyer, without stepping foot on foreign soil, without wielding a weapon, was already in the process of saving American and Allied lives throughout the Pacific in the upcoming Second World War. November 30th, 1941. At the 12th Naval District in Pearl Harbor, cryptographer Robert Ogg, who apparently was one of the students of Agnes Meyer Driscoll, picked up a code, 5 numbers. Aha! It was the Imperial flagship Akagi, which means Red Castle. And the Akagi was telling one or more tanker Marus to close up for refueling at the international date line, for the Japanese Hawaii Strike Force was heading from west to east. There could be no other conclusion as to the destination. It was going to be to attack Pearl Harbor itself. Ogg conferred with his superior, who said, I have a line to President Franklin Roosevelt at the White House, but he rarely ever answers it. However, I have another line to his personal assistant, Harry Hopkins, who often does answer. And so, I will pass on that information to Mr. Hopkins. Whether or not he did is unknown, but the attack on Pearl Harbor is obviously well known. Most Americans at home were shocked, except for Agnes Meyer Driscoll. She wasn't surprised at all. Her students, who were in cryptography, had learned how to break the code based on her instructions. So, there we are. The question, of course, remains, and it's an enigma. Did President Roosevelt receive information if it was passed on? Or did he not? And if he did receive it, did he decide to do anything or not? You, my fellow Americans and kind audience, are left to decide for yourselves until more information surfaces. However, considering that there are still 1 million code decrypts at Archives 2 in Maryland, it's going to be a few years or more before we know the answers to those. But at any rate, Agnes Meyer did not receive any credits or high honors, any promotions or salary. At that time, the Navy was concerned more with the prospects of promoting what they called rotational men officers in the Navy than women employees in some office in Washington, D.C. And so, Meyer, and she was Driscoll later on, was more or less sidelined. And after the war, she claimed that she had broken the Japanese naval code, but maybe she was a crackpot. And at any rate, Commander Joseph Rochefort at Station Hypo, a listening post on Oahu, had been given credit in March 1942 for breaking the Japanese naval code, Cinderella-like in time, just before the Battle of Midway. Again, it's one of those things in history that has not yet been fully clarified. Did he originally break it, or was this just a modification that he was able to solve? At any rate, Rochefort and his team got credit for breaking the code officially long after World War II ended as an organization, quote unquote. Meyer was relegated to obscurity They did use her in the Cold War to try to break Russian codes. But when she retired in 1959, no one took note. She was one of those unsung American heroes who earned a place on the honor roll of naval cryptologists, but nothing more or less. She is the neglected giant, perhaps, of code breakers in world history. Now we move on to Reuben Rivers, born in Oklahoma. He was part African American, part Native American, graduated high school in Oklahoma City and went working on the railroad, but his life changed because in late 1941 he had to sign up for selective service, and in early 1942 he was drafted. At this time, African Americans generally were used only in the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, but there was an experimental tank unit in the depths of the Louisiana swamps at Cape Claiborne, and Reuben Rivers and several other blacks were to be incorporated into a light tank unit, the 761st Tank Unit, later known as the Black Panthers. The tanks were like a light anti-tank gun or a heavy rifle could probably penetrate the body of the army. But these men were going to eventually be trained on the medium Sherman tanks with the 75 millimeter cannons. And they would be sent overseas in 1944 on the SS Esperance Bay. They arrived in England, and finally, in October of 44, 4 months after Normandy, they landed at Omaha Beach, which was by now very quietly secured. But they then moved a record march of 400 miles in a few days' time to join Patton's army, which was bogged down in the Sarre Basin in southeastern France. And here, one recalls the sobriquet Buffalo Soldiers. Were these perhaps going to winter the modern-day armored Buffalo Soldiers that symbolized the brethren from the early horse cavalry days of the old American West? Patton himself received them, and Patton said to them, "I didn't pick you because I didn't think you were any good. On the contrary, I picked you because I think you're very good. Your entire race is looking up to you to carry forward in battle, to give them better freedoms in a post-war America and world." He said, "Your task is simply this. Anyone you see not in a U.S. uniform, shoot them. It doesn't matter if it's a child, an elderly person." He said, "Shoot everybody." So that was Patton's clear orders, and they said, "Yes, sir." So the French villages were very, very stubbornly held by the Germans. Village by village, they had to be taken, and Patton's army needed to get up some steam. The reason that he asked for the black tankers, however, was because white manpower was being attritioned away in combat after D-Day. It was not a cakewalk going to Germany through France. And so this is why black tankers of the 761st Tank Battalion now came to the fore. In November 44, the first snows fell in southern France. And the village at Hampont, which was on a hill, had been fortified by a major roadblock. A tanker jumped out of his tank. It was Reuben Rivers. He took down the roadblock hand by hand himself, a one-man army. Then he jumped back in his tank, and he forwarded the spearhead of the events that took this village. After that, the Silver Day, Rivers leads the way, took hold in his unit and reverberated throughout Patton's army. At another point in the battle, which was quite fluid, he was told by rear area headquarters not to attempt to take a certain village, and he replied, "I've already been through it. I'm on my way to the next one." And so this was the kind of person that perhaps had not been seen since the days of Phil Sheridan or George Armstrong Custer. At any rate, Rivers, badly wounded in the battle, decided that he would advance further, and when he did so, disregarding orders, he was killed. And he received the Silver Star, but his commander, David Williams II, a wealthy white in civilian life, decided that he was going to crusade. And he did so for 53 years until Rivers was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. And our last, William Bell Toledo, a Navajo code talker, served with the United States Marines on Pacific Islands. There was a Japanese samurai night bonsai charge. There were secret messages that were coded for reinforcements and supplies, but because they were in Navajo, they could not be decoded by the enemy. After the war, Toledo, who was honorably discharged, was invited to the States to give talks on what the Navajo code talkers did. And ironically, he was invited to Japan and to Hiroshima. At the Children's Peace Park there, he gave a spiritual healing prayer in Navajo. No one understood it, but it was so soothing that it was as if Toledo was an international goodwill ambassador, at least on an informal basis. And so, that includes, or concludes the 5 American heroes of war, a mere sampling. So, are there any questions from the audience at this time? Yes.
I may be confused, but wasn't there another female code breaker?
Yes, the question is, were there other female code breakers in the U.S. Navy? And yes, there were. Meyer was one of the more prominent ones. But yes, indeed, there were other women, but it was a man's world, as we know, back in the 1940s and 1950s, and so they reaped the credit. It should be said, though, that Agnes Meyer Driscoll was a loner, and she had gotten into a severe automobile accident in 1937 and was very disfigured from formerly being a very pretty individual. And at the office, the men kind of thought she didn't look that pretty anymore, and so she felt a bit slighted over that. And she became more and more of a loner, but code breaking, although she was a great pioneer, was something in which collaboration is very necessary. Both men and women cryptographers getting together as a team to solve enemy codes. Are there any other questions?
No more questions. We got to move on.
Okay.
All right, now I'd like to introduce Jesse Branch from the United States Marine Corps.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure privilege and honor to be a part of this great program this afternoon. I'm going to tell you, as one of the most famous movie stars said to her late husband, I'm not going to keep you long. I just want to talk a little bit, and I'm going to be very brief. I do have another engagement, but just want to hit some highlights of the blacks in the Marine Corps, past, present, and future. Black people have fought in every war, from the Revolutionary War through the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. 93 African Americans have been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. The last African American to be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor was Sergeant Major Hanley, United States Marine Corps retired. He received the reward in 2018, and this was for his heroic duties in Vietnam in 1958. The Marine Corps became a part of the armed forces in 1775. Still, it was 160 years before African Americans was allowed to join the Marine Corps. And it came about because the President of the United States issued an executive order to recruit and enlist all races in all branches of the military. In 1948, President issued another executive order to integrate all branches of the service. A few notable individuals I like to just mention. The first one is Oprah Mae Johnson. She was the first female Marine. She was in the Marine Corps in 1918. The second person was John Martin. He was the first male Marine. He was in the Marine Corps in 1776, 1 year after the Marine Corps was actually a part of the military. Now, he was a slave, and he was in the Marine Corps unbeknown to his master. So he was kind of went behind the scenes to become a Marine. Then in 1943, Howard Perry enlisted in the Marine Corps. This was after the executive order. Annie Grimes joined the Marine Corps in 1950. She became the first black female officer. She retired after 20 years of service. Sergeant Gilbert Johnson, Hashmark Johnson. He joined the Marine Corps in 1943, and he was one of the first black drill instructors. In 1974, the Montford Point Marine Camp was rededicated and renamed Camp Johnson in his honor. My uncle, Frederick C. Branch, was commissioned the first black officer in the Marine Corps as a second lieutenant in 1943. He retired. After he retired in 1995, a building was named in his honor in Quantico, Virginia, the first ever for a black serviceman to have a building or any establishment dedicated in his honor. Frank Peterson, he was the first black pilot in 1952 in Korea. It so happened that I was in Korea at the same time. Of course, I was not an officer, I was a PFC. He was the first black pilot. He served in the Marine Corps for 36 years, 2 years in the Navy, a total of 36 years of service. He retired in 1979. He was promoted to one-star general, the first to obtain a star in the United States Marine Corps. After he retired as a general, a lieutenant general, which is the third star general in the Marine Corps. Currently, from my research, there are 88 generals in the Marine Corps. 6 are black. I just want to touch on the last 2, or the most famous 2 that made history. The first one is Leona Mela, promoted to Major General, the first black female to be promoted in the history of the Marine Corps as a 2-star general. She was promoted in 2022. The next one is Michael Lanley, promoted to 4-star general in 2022. He is the first 4-star general in the entire history of the Marine Corps. There's others that I could talk about, but due to the time restraint, I'm going to move on to a few of my personal experiences in the past years that I served. I joined the Marine Corps in 1951. I was born and raised in the southeastern part of the United States, South Carolina. In 1933, and most of you may remember, was the years of the Great Depression. Needless to say, it was during the integrated years. After some debating whether I was going to go into the service, my decision was to go into the Marine Corps. No offense, but I wanted to be the best I could be. No offense to the Then I moved to basic training. Basic training was very difficult, to say the least. I was one of the only 4 black Marines in a company of 40 Marines. Needless to say, we endured mental and physical incidents, and we had no recourse. However, upon my graduation, I found out that the Marine Corps training is what they call psychological training. That was really surprising to me. I didn't see anything psychological about it. Moving on to my next duty station was Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. By then, the armed forces was pretty much integrated. The base was well integrated. However, the city or the town of Jacksonville was still segregated. And I'm telling you firsthand, this is not what I read in a book. This is my personal experience. I could not go into a restaurant or any other establishment in that town. They had signs posted, white only. The bus station, the train station, they had water fountains, and waiting room was labeled white and colored. However, there was a bright side. We did have a place to go. We could find some entertainment, which was known as Across the Tracks. This was the black neighborhood. The commanding general at that time, he made a decision to furnish transportation for all Marines going into town so that we didn't have to use public transportation. When we used public transportation, we had to ride in the back of the bus. Going on to Camp Pendleton, I had no incident in Camp Pendleton, but in Korea, I did have an incident. I was placed in a squad of 4. We were assigned to go up to Pork Chop Hill. Once we arrived at Pork Chop Hill, we were bombarded with shrapnel. The senior squad leader, of course, prior to going up to Pork Chop Hill, he made the remark that he was not going to go into combat with a black person. He didn't even have the courtesy to say a black Marine. However, it didn't go very well. The commanding officer gave him the ultimatum that he either took his assignment or would be court-martialed. While we was in Pork Chop Hill, as I mentioned before, we was hit with mortar fire. The entire platoon was injured. Only 3 of us survived. The very leader of the squad was severely injured. Not thinking about what he had said prior, I carried him to a safe area to be medevac into Yokosuka Hospital. That was the right thing to do. Later on, we were back in the States, but a year or so later, I received a letter from this individual. Of course, he was thanking me for saving his life, and he asked me if I would be the best man in his wedding. Because he was still a brother in arms. Vietnam was my next area. I did not have an incident in Vietnam. We would work very close together. We were up on Monkey Mountain, which overlooks Da Nang. I didn't see combat in Vietnam. I was there for a short period of time, and we were sent back to the States with a replacement that came over. Once I was back in the States, I bounced around to different assignments and ended up in Yuma, Arizona, which is the hottest place in the world. Yuma, Arizona. They were in need of a first sergeant, and I was assigned. After being there for about a year, I was promoted to Sergeant Major. Became the Sergeant Major of Yuma, Arizona Air Station. There's much more that I could talk about, but as I mentioned before, in the interest of time, I won't go into any of the other incidents. However, I would encourage everybody to Google Black in the Marine Corps or the history of the Marine Corps to get a better understanding of how it was then and how it is now. I just want to close by reading a quote which reads, "Freedom and the recognition of individual rights of who our revolution was all about. They were ideas that inspired our fight for independence, ideas that we have been arriving and striving for a long time. It took many years before the ideas became reality for Black citizens," unquote. I just want to say thank you for your patience in listening to my short presentation. God bless our veterans. God bless our servicemen. And God bless the United States of America.
And our last speaker, I'd like to introduce Aubrey Matthews, who will be speaking about the Tuskegee Airmen.
Good afternoon. I'm Aubrey Matthews. I'm a historian and former president of Lee A. Archer Jr. Chapter, Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated, at Travis Air Force Base. I'm honored to be here today to present the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen to you, and near the end of my presentation, I'm going to tell you the rest of the story that you haven't heard. But what I wanted to do, I wanted to start you out with the 1925 United States Army report on Negroes in the military. And I want you to remember that report because I'm going to revert back to that report later on in my presentation. And it is as follows. 1925 Army War College report said that this report set the tone on how black men were treated in the United States military until the Tuskegee experiment was put in place in 1941. On October 30, 1925, the Army War College conducted a study titled "The Use of Negro Manpower in War," signed by the prominent Major General H.E. Eli, The study concluded, remember this, concluded that black men believed themselves to be inferior to white men and lacked initiative. And we saw from this, the report claimed Negro officers not only lacked the mental capacity to command, but courage as well. So remember that report. And I wanted to let everyone know that the Tuskegee Airmen experiment got off the ground thanks to 3 women. It was actually 3 women who actually were responsible for getting the wings for the Tuskegee Airmen. And they were Willa Brown, Mary Bethune, and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Willa Brown, she was a lieutenant in the United States Civil Air Patrol, and she was a pilot. And she had a school to help things get rolling. And Mary Bethune was a trained educator and head of the National Council of Negro Women. She used her authority as the only female member of President Franklin Roosevelt's Black Cabinet. And her close friendship with the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, to lobby against segregation for the integration of the pilot program. The key was to get the government to open training programs on the campuses of historic black colleges and universities. And of course, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt is the one who helped really get things rolling. And if you ever seen the Tuskegee Airmen movie, where she takes that first ride with a black pilot, that actually got the ball rolling. And so we come down from 1925, we go to the civilian pilot training program, which is where a lot of blacks received their wings. That was in 1939. Many blacks wanted to fly, but because of the way things were in this country at the time, they were second-class citizens. Many flight schools didn't want to train them. So as a result, we have this civilian pilot training program that allowed them to obtain their wings. Well, as it was, 1941, the United States entered World War II. And this is where things, the dynamics begin to change. As it was, there were those in Washington that did not want blacks to actually fly airplanes. And many thought that they didn't have the capability to fly aircraft. But as the presentation moves on, it's going to be proven wrong. So as it was, blacks wanted to participate in the war in Europe, but were not allowed to. Eventually, black pilots started to train there in Tuskegee, Alabama, and they trained, and then they trained some more. All the while, the pilots, white pilots, were over in Europe and also in the Far East fighting the war, but the blacks were a little upset because they wanted to be part of the action. Despite being treated as second-class citizens, they were still willing to put their lives on the line to fight for this country, regardless as being treated as second-class citizens. As it was, Eleanor Roosevelt became concerned that the blacks were not overseas fighting for their country in the Air Force, And so she took a little trip down to Tuskegee, Alabama, and wanted to know why. And she wanted to take a flight in one of the aircraft piloted by one of the Tuskegee Airmen, and her security detail were a little bit nervous about it, but she insisted. And so she was taken for a flight by Charles, nicknamed Chief Anderson. He took her around, and I wanted to mention something about Chief Anderson. I have spoken with a number of Tuskegee Airmen, and they told me he was the man. He had over 50,000 flying hours, and that was a lot of hours. And he was portrayed by Lawrence Fishburne in the movie Tuskegee Airmen. And so after she came back, she went to Washington and talked to President Roosevelt. And soon afterwards, the Tuskegee Airmen were sent over to North Africa. They were the 99th Pursuit Squadron. And so at that time, they were not assigned to bomber escort. They were assigned to ground support duties. So as it was, they were supporting troops in the ground, on the ground capacity. And there were those still in Washington that wanted to have the blacks removed, brought back to the States, because they just thought it was a waste of money just having them over there. But as it was, the Tuskegee Airmen continued to support ground troops, and their big moment came during Operation Corkscrew. Now, Operation Corkscrew involved Pantelleria Island, and Allied troops wanted Pantelleria Island on a foothold as a stepping stone towards Italy. So the Tuskegee Airmen, they were assigned under Operation Corkscrew